Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In the last video we were working on the Fiat 500, replacing the front wing and the inner and outer tie rod and just do some general repairs. In this video we're going to carry on working on the repairs on the front right hand corner. This time we're going to be replacing the shock absorber. Hopefully that will fix the wheel alignment issue. We'll also be changing the hub, just as more of a precaution than anything else. I'm giving this car to my sister, so I need to make sure that this car is going to be safe to drive for her and that everything else on this car is done properly. So to start off, we'll get the car jacked up again. We're going to use my amazing tiny 2-ton trolley jack and hope this does the job. Last time I used it, the actual wheel fell off, so I do need to upgrade to something better. So the first thing I need to do is get the wheel off so I can get access to the hub nut. So to get the hub nut off, first I need to unstake it from the drive shaft. Some hub nuts are staked in position. That stops them coming loose while the car's driving. Others might use what they call a castle nut, which is held in place by a cotter pin, or what I call a split pin. So to release this hub nut, all I'm using is a pointed chisel and a hammer just to bend the material back a little bit. So once I've unstaked the nut, I'll then be able to get the socket on to break it loose. And to do this, I'm using a large 32mm socket and a 4-foot breaker bar. So now I've got the hub nut undone, just back with the car on the jack, get the wheel off, and start to lubricate all of these nuts and bolts because they have not been taken off for quite some time and they look really rusty. I left the WD-40 to soak for about 30 minutes before I came back to undo all of the nuts and bolts. I started off with the outer tie rod end, as that would have been the easiest since that was the last thing I put on the car. So once I got the outer tie rod loosened off, I then turned to the Droplink, using a spanner and an Allen key to undo these two nuts. So with the old Droplink off, you can see how much movement there is, versus how much movement there isn't with the new Droplink. This damage was either due to the impact from the accident or it's just really old and worn out. This can cause a knocking sound while you're driving. So with the Droplink off, I then loosened the bolts holding the shock absorber to the hub assembly. To get access to the top nut, I needed to remove the windscreen wipers and the trim. Then I can get access with my impact driver to undo that top nut. With the top nut removed, I then went back to removing the bolts holding the suspension to the hub. With the suspension out, I then used spring compressors to compress the spring so I could undo the secondary locking nut. With the old strut disassembled, I could then reuse the old spring on the new assembly. I decided to also change the bearing on the new shock, more of a precaution than anything else. Installing the new strut assembly was just the reverse of removing the old one. At this point, the hub hadn't turned up, so I decided to put the wheel back on and just check the alignment, hoping that the suspension might have fixed the problem. Unfortunately, the wheel still wasn't sitting right, so that meant I had to change the hub when it turned up. Luckily, everything was still fresh in my mind, so it wasn't going to be too much of a big job taking everything apart again. Problem was, I had to take it all apart again. As you can see, you don't need that many tools. A couple of spanners, some screwdrivers, a ratchet that's older than me, and if you have one, an impact driver. The only tool I didn't need this time was an angle grinder. But there's always next time. With the old hub off and out of the way, I unboxed the eBay hub and compared it to the one I'd just taken off. I couldn't see any difference between the two or any damage on the one I'd just taken off. I decided to swap it out anyway, more of a precaution than anything else, as I'm giving this car away to my sister, so everything needs to be done properly. For some reason, putting the second hand one back on proved a little bit more trickier than I thought it was going to be, so I had to break out the hammer. Once I could see a couple of threads coming through from the drive shaft, I then used the hub nut to hold it in place. That way at least the hub wouldn't come back off again. Once I was happy with that, I then started to do it up using a ratchet. I jacked up the suspension using the second jack, that way it compressed the spring so I could line up the holes and get the bolts in. Once that was done, it was time to get the brakes back on. Now I've got the brakes back on, I can finally get the wheel on, hopefully for the last time. So after changing the suspension, changing the hub and the inner and outer tie rods, the wheel was still not aligned correctly. That was until I noticed something really obvious, and I should have checked it first. Using an industry standard technique, I used my finger to check the position of the top mount and found that the driver's side was actually sitting further back than it should have. All I needed to do was undo that top nut again and just pull the suspension forward, and that would have fixed the issue. And I wouldn't have had to change every part that I have so far. But hey, you live and learn, and at least I know the car's safe. To make sure I did this right, my friend Rich went out and got me a brand new set of Halfords Offset spanners. That way I can torque everything up correctly without risking anything going wrong. And they made a big difference. Once I was happy with the position of the top mount, I then used these spanners to lock off the top nut. They're a lot deeper than the ones I have, which made the job a lot easier. Once I finally got the suspension finished off, it was then time to turn my attention to the servicing, and I wanted to make sure that this car was running as best as it can before I gave it over to my sister. So to do this, I ordered all of the parts from Autodoc, where you can find parts for all makes and models. And the prices aren't too bad either. You have to wait a little while, maybe a week, but it's worth it. So the first thing I do is always open the oil filler cap. Then I open the drain plug. So while the oil was draining, I then located the oil filter. So I could change that next. On most cars, the oil filter is under the engine. On the 500, it's on top. When changing the oil filter, I also changed the oil seal, which goes on the oil cap. With the oil drained, I then replaced the sump plug with a new one. Next, I changed the spark plugs which were under the engine cover, taking care when disconnecting the vacuum line so it don't cause any damage. To get to the spark plugs, I needed to remove the coil packs, which were held in place by 10mm bolts. I always check that the spark plug will fit the socket before taking out the old one. The old spark plugs don't look too bad, but these are probably the original ones, as the car has only done 40,000 miles. So with the new spark plugs in, it's time to torque them up and then change out the air filter. This old air filter definitely needed changing. So now I've got the air filter changed, it was back on with the engine cover. With the engine cover back on, it's now time to top up the oil. I'm using Castrol Magnatec 5W40 and a filling jug to avoid any spillage. This channel isn't sponsored yet, but I will add links to the description below for Autodoc and Halfords for the tools that I bought. Hopefully this may help somebody in future. With the suspension repaired and the service completed, it's now time to hand over this car to my sister. If you like this video, please click on like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.